Lessons from The Last Dance. So there's a documentary on The Last Dance about Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls last season. Now if you haven't seen it, I highly suggest that you go and watch it, especially if you're an athlete. At very least, it's just an entertaining watch about, arguably one of the best sports teams, ever to exist, which also included, arguably one of the best athletes ever to play their sport. It's a very good watch. So I want to talk to you guys about my perspective from the documentary. So I watched it purely as a basketball fan, but I also took some other things away as a sports performance coach, which I think can actually be really beneficial for any and every athlete. So I'd highly recommend it, especially youth athletes, but any athlete, to watch the documentary and just watch it for what it is, entertainment's sake. But there is a couple of things that I took away from it. And the first one was mental toughness. What I believe that separates Michael Jordan from many other great basketball players, because there was heaps within that era and they all get interviewed on the documentary. But what I thought separated him from everyone else was his mental toughness. Now, I actually prefer to use the word mental resilience. Mental toughness is obviously referred to in sport as, whether you can stay strong and not break down, etc., etc. And coaches like to use it a lot, and they like to do, boot camps to make their athletes mentally tough. But in my opinion, mental toughness, it's not the same as military mental toughness, where it's life or death. Mental toughness for an athlete should be more termed as mental resilience. So the ability to be adaptable to changing circumstances. And, examples of this is, how do you take winning versus how do you take losing? How do you take pressure? How do you take the pressure of underperforming? How do you cope with injuries? So being mentally resilient means that you can take the good with the bad, and you don't just fall off the perch when things don't go your way. But at the same time, you don't go over the board and over the top when things are all your way. So you stay somewhat modest. And I thought Michael Jordan does this to an absolute T. Another person who did this really well is Kobe Bryant. That Mamba mentality. So that ability to be mentally resilient. And he refers to it a lot of the time as he made things personal. And that was really interesting. And I think a lot of great players had very similar talent to Jordan, but he just could go to a place that other people weren't willing to go. And I think that's what gave him his massive edge. Another thing I learned was the importance of playing your role. So what made that team so great was that there was guys on that team that were willing to be a role player. Dennis Rodman, I think, is the best example of this. He was a really talented guy. You see him through his high school and his collegiate days, and he was exceptional. He's the best player on their team. But as he entered into the NBA, there's a lot of other talented guys. Now, for me, he's he's a very different character. And he could have easily been if it's not about me, then I'm not about this. And what you often see is that those guys, if they're not talented enough, they fade away and they have very short-term careers. But luckily enough, I think it was actually his coach at his first team, which I can't 100% remember. It might have been Orlando, but don't quote me on that. It was probably another team. Actually recognised his talents as a defensive player, and really harnessed and got around him in that regard. So instead of sulking about not being the best player, he just became the best role player he could become, and arguably one of the best defensive players of all time. That's because he was willing to accept the fact that he actually might not be the best at everything, but he's got this other area that he's very good at, and he just became the absolute best at that. And he had a long and pretty illustrious career because of it. He'll likely be a Hall of Famer if he isn't already. Another thing that I learnt or I picked up on was, Phil Jackson, arguably one of the best coaches of all time in any sport. But what I learned from him was great coaches coach people, or the person, not just the athlete. It's, we get caught up in a numbers game, what's this guy doing statistically, et cetera, et cetera. But we're dealing with people, being a coach myself, I'm dealing with the people, not just the athlete. And I thought Phil did this really well. And he's proven that he can do it in multiple, it wasn't just a fluke with Michael Jordan. He had Kobe Bryant and Shaq, basically straight after. And there's some big egos. So what impressed me is how he harnessed the ego of Michael Jordan, and you can see the difference that Phil Jackson made between when he wasn't head coach and he was head coach. That, they changed a few things in the team for sure, but pretty much they brought more egos in. Yeah, more talent, but it was more egos. And he really got Michael Jordan bought into the idea of, like, I know you are the greatest player. We don't necessarily need you playing any better than you can because you are already the best. But if you utilize the rest of your team here and you understand their strengths, then this will make you look greater and we'll be able to win as a team. And it seems easy to do saying it out loud, but it is extremely challenging. Jordan would have been on like 20 times what Phil was making, probably even more, to be honest, especially when you factor in all the contracts and endorsements. But to be able to get a guy like that and put some of his ego aside for the greater good of the association and the team is just remarkable to see a coach go to work like that. And one of the last things that I picked up was actually the cost of professional sport. And I think this is really good for young athletes to recognise, because this stuff gets put up in lights. And to be honest, athletes these days are more like movie stars than they are anything else, especially their bank accounts. And I think the example of this is when you see Jordan. He's a super renowned guy. Like, even to this day, everyone knows who Michael Jordan is. But it's kind of the scene early on in the documentary where he's in a hotel room just smoking a cigar. And he's just there by himself, and he lets the camera crew in, and he's basically like, this is the only time that I get to myself, and you guys want to have a chat to me now. But, he conditioned himself to tolerate that stuff. He accepted what was part and parcel. But I guess, like, at the end of the doco, I thought, like, yeah, this guy is well known and people love him, but he seems like the loneliest guy in the world. Like, a lot of his teammates and opponents didn't really have great things to say about him outside of being an exceptional basketballer. So I believe there is a bit of a sacrifice there in regards to being the best and just being a part of professional sport. There's a lot of external pressure that comes their way. And I think it's just important. And if we're coaches and we're in a position where we can help young athletes rise through the ranks and just be able to handle these situations. I mean, you see young athletes get into trouble all the time, and it's probably because they haven't been educated around what to expect in a professional environment. All in all, really good documentary, but I think it can be a little bit more than just entertainment. It has a lot of underlying tones that I think all athletes can benefit from. So if you haven't watched it, I highly suggest go and watch it, at least for the fun of it. Okay, thanks for that, guys.